April 29th, 1945. The sky was the color of old ash. A cold wind moved through the Bavarian countryside, carrying with it a smell that the soldiers could not yet name. Something sweet, something rotting, something that did not belong to the living world. The men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, moved in loose formation along the road outside Munich. They had marched across North Africa. They had bled at Anzio. They had pushed through southern France and into the heart of Germany itself. These were not soft men. These were soldiers who had learned to sleep through artillery and eat cold rations beside the bodies of their friends. They had been told there was a German installation ahead, a prison camp of some kind. They were not told what kind. It was a soldier near the front of the column who first saw the train. It sat on a spur of track outside the camp's main fence, a long line of cattle cars, perhaps 40 of them, stretching back into a curve of trees. The cars were closed. Nothing moved. No sound came from them. One of the men approached and pulled open a wooden door. The smell hit him first. He stepped back. He put his hand over his mouth. Then he looked inside. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most War Legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The car was filled with bodies, hundreds of them, stacked one upon another like firewood, limbs tangled together, skin pulled tight over bone. Some of the dead still had their eyes open. They stared at nothing. Their mouths were slightly parted, as though they had been interrupted mid-sentence and had simply stopped. The soldier did not shout. He did not raise his rifle. He stood completely still. Word passed back through the column without anyone quite deciding to say it aloud. Men pushed forward. Some peered inside the cars and then turned away immediately. Others could not look away at all. A young private from Oklahoma, 19 years old, who had never once cried during the war, sat down in the mud on the side of the tracks and wept openly, without shame, without any attempt to stop himself. A sergeant who had fought at Salerno leaned against the side of the train car and vomited into the grass. Nobody spoke for a very long time. These were not soldiers who had been broken by small things, but this was not a small thing. This was something else entirely, a category of horror that human language had not yet built adequate words for. The men standing at that train were among the first Americans to understand, with their own eyes, with their own lies, with the bile rising in their own throats, what had been happening in the heart of civilized Europe for years. And they had not known. That, perhaps, was the cruelest part of all. They entered Dachau through the main gate. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. The iron letters arched overhead, and the soldiers passed beneath them without understanding the full weight of the mockery they represented. Not yet, not until they had walked another 100 yards into what lay beyond. The prisoners, who were still alive, came forward slowly, hesitantly, as though they could not quite believe that the men in unfamiliar uniforms were real, or safe, or both. Their bodies were extraordinary in their devastation. Skeletal frames draped in striped cloth, eyes too large for their faces, legs that trembled under the weight of simply standing upright. Some reached out and touched the sleeves of the American soldiers, running their fingers along the fabric as though confirming that solid things still existed in the world. Deeper into the camp, the soldiers found what the SS had tried to conceal, or perhaps had long since stopped bothering to conceal. Piles of bodies, not hidden, not buried, simply stacked in open areas. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. The math of the dead was too overwhelming to calculate in the moment. There was a large building with industrial ovens inside, brick chambers, iron doors, the ash of the burned still resting in the grates. There were rooms that looked like hospitals, but were something else, something that had worn the costume of medicine, while committing acts no physician in history should have ever performed. The soldiers moved through it all in a terrible silence. Somewhere in that silence, something changed. It was not a decision. It was not a moment any man could have pointed to afterward and said, "There, that is when it happened." It was more like a pressure building inside a room with no windows, slow, invisible, and then suddenly beyond any door's capacity to hold it back. Shock became rage. The frozen disbelief that had gripped these men at the train, the paralysis of the unimaginable, began to thaw into something hotter and far more dangerous. Fists clenched, jaws set hard. Eyes that had been wide with horror narrowed into something else entirely. These men had signed up to fight soldiers. What they were looking at was not the aftermath of combat. It was the aftermath of something that had been done, deliberately and systematically, to people who could not fight back, to the elderly, the sick, children, civilians, over years and years and years, while the world outside went about its business. In that moment, the rules of war began to feel meaningless. The remaining SS guards at Dachau had not fled. Some had stayed because they had nowhere to go. Some had stayed because they had nowhere to go. Some had stayed because surrender seemed safer than running into a countryside full of advancing Allied armies. A few, perhaps, had stayed because they genuinely did not understand the magnitude of what they had participated in, or perhaps because they had told themselves for so long that they were simply doing their duty, that the lie had calcified into something they could no longer see around. They were assembled in the camp's coal yard, near a long whitewashed wall. There were perhaps 100 of them, disarmed and standing in rough formation under the guard of American soldiers. The SS men held their hands up or clasped them behind their heads. Some kept their chins raised. Others stared at the ground. The American soldiers surrounding them had just come from the ovens, from the piles of the dead, from the cattle cars full of people who had been transported to this place from across an entire continent so that they could be murdered at industrial scale. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 157th Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion, had given orders. The prisoners were to be taken under control. They were to be processed. The rules of war, the rules that separated armies from what these men had just witnessed, were to be observed. But rules require distance, and distance, on that afternoon, in that place, was the one thing no American soldier at Dachau possessed. Near the coal yard wall, an American machine gun was set up. The SS guards were lined up with their backs against the white plaster. A soldier, his name has been debated by historians ever since. The chain of command in those minutes was too fractured and too charged to reconstruct with certainty. Positioned himself behind the weapon. For several seconds, nobody moved. The prisoners stood. The soldiers stood. The cold Bavarian wind moved through the yard and carried its smell across everything. Then the gun opened fire. It was not a long burst, seconds perhaps, but in those seconds, 17 SS guards were cut down against the wall of the coal yard at Dachau. What happened in the immediate aftermath was not glory. There was no triumph in the faces of the men who had pulled the trigger or stood nearby. There was, if anything, a strange and terrible stillness, the kind that follows a thing that cannot be undone. Some of the soldiers looked away, some stood exactly as they had stood before. The sounds of the camp continued around them, shouts, distant gunfire from other parts of the compound, the barely audible sounds of survivors. The war had come to Dachau, and Dachau had come back. It was not confined to the coal yard. Across the sprawling camp complex, in the minutes and hours following the initial breach, the violence fractured and spread. In some sections, SS guards who had surrendered were beaten. In others, prisoners who had survived years of starvation and brutality took matters into their own hands against the men who had held them. American soldiers, in some cases, stood back. Not out of cowardice, these were men of uncommon bravery, but out of something more complicated, a moral vertigo, an inability in that particular hour to decide with any confidence which side of the line they were supposed to be standing on. Some officers intervened immediately, shouting, physically positioning themselves between guards and the crowds around them, insisting that the law was still the law, that the war was almost over, that this was not who they were. Others turned their backs and saw nothing. It was Lieutenant Colonel Sparks himself who finally moved through the chaos with his pistol drawn, not pointed at the prisoners, but fired into the air. The shots cracked across the yard and broke the terrible momentum of the afternoon. He shouted. He organized. He separated the living from the dead, the guards from the liberated, the soldiers from whatever they had temporarily become in the shadow of the ovens and the cattle cars. Slowly, like a man coming back to himself after a fever, order returned to Dachau. The survivors were given food, water, medical attention. The remaining SS guards were placed under formal guard and processed as prisoners of war. The sun began to move toward the Bavarian hills. The investigation began within days. Investigators arrived with notebooks and cameras. Testimonies were collected. Photographs were taken of the wall in the coal yard, of the bodies still lying where they had fallen. Reports were compiled and passed upward through the chain of command. The conclusion was unavoidable. American soldiers, in the hours following the liberation of Dachau, had executed surrendered prisoners of war. By the established rules of war, by the very codes that separated armies from the institutions they had come to liberate, What had happened against that white wall was a violation. The report found its way to General George Patton. Patton, who had himself seen the camps, who had ordered his own men to march German civilians through Buchenwald so that they could not claim ignorance, read the findings of the investigation. He shelved it. The decision was not recorded in any dramatic proclamation. There was no press conference, no public reckoning, no court-martial. The file was closed. The men involved were never formally charged. The investigation dissolved quietly into the vast administrative machinery of a war that was within days officially over. There are those who argue that Patton understood something the formal record could not accommodate, that the soldiers who walked into Dachau on April 29, 1945, were not the same men who had walked out of basic training, and that the law, in its clean and abstract perfection, had not been present in that coal yard with them and had not seen what they had seen. There are others who argue that this is precisely why the law exists, not for the easy moments, but for the moments when keeping to it costs something real. Both arguments have lived side by side in the historical record ever since. Neither has won. The men who were at Dachau that day came home. They went back to farms and offices in small towns and factories. They raised children and grew old and, for the most part, said very little about what they had seen and done in those hours in Bavaria. Some gave testimonies decades later when the weight of history pressed them to speak. They described the train, the ovens, the piles of the dead. They described, with varying degrees of clarity and distance, what had happened in the coal yard. None of them, in the testimonies that survive, described what they had done as heroic. Most described it as something that happened, something that could not be separated from everything that surrounded it. Something that belonged entirely to that place, that afternoon, that smell, those open eyes staring out from the cattle cars. Historians have wrestled with Dachau ever since. It sits at the intersection of the war's most difficult questions, about justice and law, about what violence does to the people who witness it, about the distance between what human beings are capable of under extreme conditions and what they are supposed to be. There is no comfortable answer. There has never been one. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is that the men of the 45th Infantry Division encountered something at Dachau for which their training, their experience, their moral frameworks, and their humanity had not prepared them, because nothing could have. So here is the question that Dachau leaves behind, not as accusation, not as judgment, but as something worth sitting with honestly. If you had walked through that gate on April 29, 1945, if you had stood at those cattle cars and breathed that air and looked at what was inside, if you had walked past the ovens and the bodies and the skeletal hands reaching for yours, would you have been able to hold the line? Would the rules have felt like rules anymore? Or would you have found in that moment that you were not as different from those soldiers as you had always assumed? The men who fought the Second World War were not monsters, they were people. And Dachau, more than almost anywhere else in that terrible conflict, is the place where the full weight of what it means to be a person, with all the darkness and the grief and the fury that entails, was put on the scale and weighed. What the scale showed is still being debated, and perhaps that debate is exactly where it should remain. Not as a verdict, but as a question we owe it to history to keep asking.